GrokTalk is 2 hours of news and opinion you could only get from GraniteGrok.com. But don't limit yourself to GrokTalk. Check us out at GraniteGrok.com. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter by searching Granite Grok.
GrokTalk. GrokTalk.
Welcome back to GrokTalk. Coming to you as always from beautiful Concord, New Hampshire, where it is clear and sunny and warming up a little bit. We've earned ourselves a break from the bitter cold that we've been experiencing for, seems like forever and ever.
You know, it definitely is a case we need a little bit of it. I looked out on my yard, and as my dog wrapped herself around the tree, I know that we've got a bunch of snow because it was up over my knee.
It was getting really, really, really deep.
Starting to. Well,
now it's rained a little, so it's kind of gone down a little bit. Now it's just icy and deep.
Yes, when I tell my coworkers out in lovely and warm San Diego I have to go rake my roof, the silence at the other end of the teleconference is deafening.
Rake your roof?
Yes.
Leaves? Palm fronds? What's the cause of that? Oh, it's snow. I've got 2 feet of snow on my roof. That's my problem. Well, talking about getting into it deep, and we've got a new guest with us today, Darren McKinney, who is with the American Tort Reform Association, ATR Foundation, and they put out a, I'm really, really loud all of a sudden. There we go. Let me turn that down a bit. They put out a document called, it's a report, and it identifies judicial hellholes, and New Hampshire has earned itself a spot on the watch list.
Great.
As a judicial hellhole. So I'd like to welcome to the program Darren McKinney. Darren, how you doing?
Pretty good, Steve. Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you. All right, so for our listeners who aren't going to be maybe not familiar with what you guys do, why don't you give us a brief overview of what ATR does, and then we'll talk about how New Hampshire got where it is.
We've been in business, so to speak. We're a nonprofit here in Washington, a trade association. We've been in action since 1986. And in very broad terms, we work at the State House level and in Congress to do what we can legislatively, as well as some other means by which to contain, to the extent possible, the parasitic plaintiff's bar in this country, which we believe too often erodes our economic competitiveness, erodes the public's respect for the rule of law, and arguably even more importantly, erodes America's long-standing and traditional sense of personal responsibility. Our annual Judicial Hellholes report has, for 12 years now, sought to identify troubled jurisdictions where judges particularly, because, I mean, look, you can't hate, I suppose you could, but whether you hate a trial lawyer for greedily trying to make as much money as he or her can with meritless lawsuits, ultimately it's the judges who are responsible for what juries get to hear by way of evidence and what they don't get to hear. So we try to focus most of our reporting in the Judicial Hellholes report on troubled judges, and as you suggested in your introduction, Superior Court Judge Peter Fauver made our watch list this year with the MTBE litigation that's rather noted up there.
Before we get into this, what do you guys use as benchmarks for making your determinations? What are the things that you look for? Obviously, this is a big case that we're going to talk about in a minute. It doesn't make any sense at all, but when you're looking at everybody, what are the things that you guys look at that you rate these states by?
Well, our principal criterion and definition of a judicial hellhole is a jurisdiction, a civil court jurisdiction. And mind you, we're not talking anything about criminal law here. It's all civil law. Is a civil court jurisdiction where judges systematically apply or fail to apply rules and procedures that disadvantage defendants, and typically these are out-of-state, presumably deep-pocket defendants that can be fleeced of their money. But increasingly, as we see out in California with Abuse of Americans with Disabilities Act lawsuits, mom and pop shops can get swept up in these judicial hellholes too, and face very adverse consequences. So, it would take a while, and I'm game if you're game, but I'd have to kind of backtrack into much of what we very broadly call tort reform, but there are a variety of means by which judges and plaintiffs' lawyers can disadvantage the defendants, and of course, similarly, conversely, I should say, there are any number of legislative remedies, and for that matter, judicial reform remedies that don't necessarily have to go through lawmakers and a governor to make the civil court jurisdictions more fair, which is our ultimate goal.
We can probably address tort reform in a little bit. Let's get to the MBTE thing. I know that most of New Hampshire probably only heard in the news that Christmas came and we got a couple $100 million, but they probably don't know the dirty details in the backgrounds. And since this is really the case that kind of pushed us on the watch list, why don't you give us a little background on that?
Sure. MTBE is short for methyl tertiary butyl ether, and it is a gasoline additive that the federal EPA and state authorities began back in the 1980s to require as an additive in gasoline for good reason, because it reduces tailpipe emissions that deplete ozone layers and otherwise pollute our atmosphere. So, well-intentioned MTB additives became mandatory, and what this lawsuit filed by the state of New Hampshire, not using, I should note, and this may be crucial in our discussion later, but certainly what got our attention in writing our judicial hellholes report, rather than using staff attorneys at the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General, the then Attorney General, hired on a contingency fee basis private sector personal injury lawyers who were political allies and so forth, in the hopes, or in their hopes, in the attorney's hopes of scoring quite a big lucrative payday were they to win this lawsuit, which they ultimately did, at least at the trial level, and invariably this case is going to be appealed. But the essence of it was that rather than sue, and the lawsuit, I should say, alleged that any number of gas station storage tanks, and we've all been around, pulled into a gas station to fill up when the delivery truck is there, and they're filling up the underground storage tank with the gasoline that we'll all buy for the next couple of weeks before the next shipment. And the allegation was that any number of these storage tanks over time leaked, and MTBE contaminated the groundwater of various New Hampshire regions and so forth. And rather than sue the local gas station franchisee, who's ultimately is responsible for his or her own storage tanks, the state decided, no, they don't have enough money. We'll go after ExxonMobil because they've got deep pockets, and we can fleece them for far more than we could ever squeeze out of mom-and-pop gas station owners. So that's the essence of the lawsuit that we're about to talk about.
Okay, and you said they've appealed it, or they're going to appeal it?
Well, as I understand it, the last I knew, and this was days ago, Superior Court Judge Peter Favre was still considering what are known as post-trial motions. Exxon has raised, more than 24 issues, points of law and evidence that was disallowed during the trial and so forth. So the judge could conceivably do any number of things at any point during the next, few days or couple of months. He could conceivably dial back considerably the $236 million verdict that was rendered by the jury. he could do a lot of things. He could change the outlook on this case considerably. But assuming he's not prepared to do much of that, if any, by way of lessening the burden on ExxonMobil, ExxonMobil will all but invariably appeal this case within this, up the chain of appeals in the state. So that's almost a given, and so this case may not be over for some time.
This is Skip, and I want to say thanks for coming on the show as well. You said a couple things right from the get-go. One about the parasitic lawyers, and I was hoping to to get I have my own definition of parasitic, and I was hoping that you might be able to give us yours. But you also said that the local governments and the state governments made it into law that the refiners had to use MTBE in that. So, we're facing a couple of other issues here, but I've just noticed that oftentimes it is government who has done the original screw-up. Then they pass more laws to fix what they perceive to be a problem and never telling the public, oh, by the way, we made this bad in the first place. And then later on, several years or even a couple decades later, oh, look at this other problem that we have to fix right away, which, again, if you trace it back, goes back to government. Is this one of those cases where it really was government who created the problem via a mandate or regulation or what have you, and now they're just suing the poor, hapless people that are just obeying the law and created the gas with the additives that was demanded of them legally?
Well, the short answer would be yes, Skip, but for the irony that there really is no problem. That's the thing. If this MTBE, groundwater contamination in the state of New Hampshire, had led to any really measurable negative impact on environmental health or human health, that would be one thing. That would be a whole different story. If, in fact, there had been leakage that led to dying deer or leukemia in children someplace. But the fact of the matter is, and you don't have to take my word for it, all of the water authorities throughout the state of New Hampshire have and continue to insist that the drinking water is wholly safe. So it's not as though there has been any real injury. I mean, historically, lawsuits require demonstrable injury before they can go forth. I mean, if my water hose, if my garden hose, and you mentioned the weather at the top there, Steve, we're going to maybe hit 60 degrees here in Washington today, and all the snow that we've been buried under, not nearly as much as you guys have been buried under, has all but melted, and so that's good. So I'm going to get out and wash 3 inches of caked salt off my car here when we finish this conversation. But if I let my water hose, I forget it's running and it flows onto my neighbor's driveway, no harm, no foul. They say, hey, Darren, turn your hose off, will you? Yeah, I will. Okay, my hose contaminated their driveway. It ran onto their driveway. But there's no harm involved, and that's essentially what we have here in New Hampshire with the so-called contamination of MTBE into the groundwater. There has been no demonstrable negative impact on wildlife, on plant life, on human life or health, and that they're bringing this lawsuit essentially as a money-making opportunity. And you noted the fact that any number of the legislators are scrambling to spend this money on any number of things that have absolutely nothing to do with cleaning up the supposedly contaminated groundwater. They want to spend it on everything they can think of, and any time a politician can spend money on his or her constituents without having to raise his constituents' taxes, that's a boon. I mean, that's paradise for politicians. And look, if the money grew on trees and you could seek your paradise in a without having to take it from out of someone else's pocket. And look, I understand that ExxonMobil isn't exactly the most sympathetic actor in American politics. But just because they're a giant corporation with billions of dollars doesn't mean it ought to be legal and right for them to be mugged in a New Hampshire courtroom, which is essentially what has happened here.
Okay, Darren, we're going to take a 60-second break, and then we're going to come back, and we have another co-host here who's joined us who's going to ask you a question. Just hang on a second. We'll be right back.
Steve McDonald here. You ever notice how Democrats like to create problems so they can then claim to solve them? Take Medicaid expansion, for example. Even if the federal government keeps its promise to New Hampshire to pay for most of it, it'll still cost New Hampshire taxpayers tens of millions of dollars more to provide inferior care and coverage to people who, for the most part, would never have needed it if Democrats hadn't reformed health care in the first place. That's right, that real expensive reform that doesn't care if it's only affordable if you act like you don't need insurance. Well, its number one claim to fame at this point is how many more people it forced onto Medicaid. And that's only because Obamacare kicks tens of millions of people off the plan they liked and were told they could keep but couldn't. So Medicaid expansion was always part of Obamacare for a reason. Democrats knew all along that the Affordable Care Act was unaffordable and they'd need to make Medicaid bigger and more expensive, so when people got their plan kicked to the health care curb, they could still sign up for something, even if it was something as crappy as Medicaid. This is Steve McDonald for GrokTalk, and we'll keep shining the light on them for you.
GrokTalk.
All right, we're back. Darren Ed Nails joined us. He's the chairman of the Coalition of New Hampshire Taxpayers. He actually allows us to use the space from which we broadcast, and he has a lot of experience in this area, and he'd like to pose a question.
By all means, Ed, go ahead.
Oh, well, I have helped some people out on the receiving end of accusations of polluting aquifers with MTBE, and the guy was left with thousands of dollars in expenses and water testing and suits and things. Several junkyards in my town when I was a selectman, people always want to shut a junkyard down. It's like a badge of honor, and they were going to use the MTBE issue to do that to a guy in West Deering, New Hampshire. It's his junkyard's located in over an aquifer, and they drilled and they drilled and they drilled and they drilled. They couldn't find anything, and the closer they got to the junkyard, they got to his property line, and they weren't allowed to drill anymore. They had to get permission to get on his property. You know, basically have someone say that it was polluted, and it turns out that when the gentleman came to drill closer to Mr. Green's property, they smelled the owner of the complainant, one of the many complainants, drive by in his truck, and they could smell gas. And they went over to his garage, and dirt floor garage, and his truck was leaking gas. So the MTBE measurement was like 128 parts per billion around that guy's home. And the closer you got to the junkyard, the less there was, until you went through the junkyard and across maybe another half mile, quarter of a mile, something like that, to his trailer park, and then it started to pick up to be 3, 5, 7, 9, something like that. But he had thousands of dollars in legal fees and water testing. I think they still monitor his property. It's a witch hunt, from what I've seen of it. You know, you take a good look at it. It's a witch hunt. It costs a lot of people money, but it's a moneymaker for those involved in the phony cleanup of it.
It's true, and I suppose my boss might cringe when he hears me say this, but because it's far afield from where we focus our efforts. But you know, whether it's MTBE in this instance, and Ed, the horror story you outlined there for us is typical, or you know, the federal government's well-intentioned efforts to increase the availability of home loans to less than rich folks that had been ongoing for a couple of decades, and then all of a sudden, when some poor people who got housing loans can't pay them back, now it's the big bad greedy bankers who are of course threatened by federal prosecution and civil fines if they didn't extend these loans for a couple of decades, but now, oh no, government had none. It's not the government's doing that businesses are being bankrupted or this junkyard guy is being hounded and forced to squeeze out of thousands of dollars that he would rather have kept in his bank account, I imagine, than having to pay geologists and aquifer specialists to come in and drill holes, but to say nothing of fighting off, to hiring lawyers and so forth and consultants. But, this kind of thing is, look, and it'd be really nice if governments, look, if a homeowners, if a neighborhood association or somebody decided to drive this MTBE lawsuit, that would be one thing. We could still fall back on all the scientific realities we've noted here, namely that there isn't any threat. There isn't any chemical threat to the environment or to human safety. We could still mention that. But at least if it was a private group alleging to have been harmed in one way or another, that would be one thing. But when you have the government who, which in this case, in good faith, look, and we all make mistakes. I can think doing X today is good, and then I can learn something tomorrow and realize that doing X wasn't good. But if I had character and integrity, I would say to those to whom doing X may have had an impact, I'd say, hey, my bad. Let's work together and get this thing sorted out and get it taken care of. I'm happy to take responsibility, but I'm not going to sue you or threaten some criminal prosecution because I'm carrying at least half the bag in terms of blame for this thing. So it'd be nice if the authorities in New Hampshire had, if in fact they could have demonstrated a legitimate problem as a result of this minor leakage of MTB from gasoline station storage tanks, if there was in fact a problem, that they could have taken a different approach in trying to solve the problem, as opposed to try to squeeze free money, out of some out-of-state deep pocket corporation.
I have to chuckle a little bit. Really, expecting that politicians are going to take responsibility for their decisions? I'm surprised.
I didn't say I expected that. I just said, wouldn't it be something? Wouldn't it be novel?
And in most cases here in New Hampshire, and I think everywhere else, most of us would be surprised if a politician did stand up and go, my bad. I do have a different question, just to put this in context, because you've been talking about the MTBE as being your primary example of why New Hampshire is becoming a judicial hellhole. Is this the only case that has put us into your favored unspeakables, or is it the general climate here in New Hampshire in the judiciary that is added to that in some small or not small measure?
I'm glad you asked that question because, and folks who aren't familiar with our annual report, I'll spell it out here a little bit, but by all means, go to judicialhellholes.org. You can read every report we've published from 2002 onward, each annual report. We've also, as of 2010, become kind of a 24/7, 365 blog. So, you can read everything we've ever written about any jurisdiction on that website. But the watch list, to be differentiated from the actual ranking of several judicial hellholes themselves, full-blown judicial hellholes, that's one thing. And almost never does a single case merit a judicial hellholes citation. But I want to stipulate that by and large, my organization and its members do not consider New Hampshire to be a hugely problematic jurisdiction. But this one case was so shocking, so alarming, so one-sided, so uneven-handed that we thought we should flag it as a warning, as a good red flag and warning for policymakers there and judges that you don't want to make this your model, folks. If you want to continue to have a reputation that is even-handed, in which businesses can survive and thrive and create jobs and wealth and tax revenues, this is the kind of case you want to prevent from going forward in the future. So that's why we flagged this particular case. But by and large, we do not. Not to say we won't change our mind, and not to say that our position won't evolve as things on the ground there in the courthouses in New Hampshire evolve. But as of this moment, we do not consider New Hampshire a judicial hellhole. But this one case was so alarming and so troubling that we thought we should flag it in hopes of heading off real problems in the future.
We got about 2 minutes. Why don't you give us some contact information and where people can go check out all this stuff other than the Hellholes Report, because I know you have another website for
Sure,
the
we do.
ATRA.
Our main website, the American Tort Reform Association's main website, is atra.org. That's ATRA.org, and you can visit that and see all our news releases, all our white papers, our documents. You can see the issues that we're tracking. We keep what may be handy to some of your listeners. They can click on a map. You can click on issues. You'll see a map. You can click on any state, find out the histories of what have been going on in every individual state with respect to tort reform advances, whether those be in state houses, legislation, or whether it be judicial reforms. A judge, kind of a hero of ours now in Philadelphia, 2 years ago, in February of 2012, undertook some reforms of his own, imposing protocol reforms on troubled judges that answered to him after we had flagged Philadelphia 2 years in a row as the nation's #1 hellhole. Very positive changes there. But, folks can see for themselves what's going on in the various states. That's atra.org. I mentioned our micro website, judicialhellholes.org. That's another interesting place. You can read about New Hampshire and neighboring states and so forth and see what's going on. But we welcome the interest and happy to be with you guys anytime you'd invite us back.
Now, do you also have your people like email you about cases that they think might qualify for your attention?
In fact, there's a spot on the Judicial Hellholes website. It's called Tell on a Hellhole, and anybody there anonymously, unless of course you want to add your name, in which case that's fine too. We're not going to rat you out to any authority, but we are very happy to take tips from the public as to what's going on. Bear in mind, and a number of the tips unfortunately come in are often about family court issues, divorces and child custody, or even criminal court issues. That is not our bailiwick. We're into lawsuits, tort lawsuits. That's our strength. So, but if you know of personally, are being impacted personally by a unholy alliance between some trial lawyers and a judge who may take political campaign contributions or otherwise be friendly with those trial lawyers, and you are getting screwed in a particular case, let us know, and then we'll in turn reach out to guys like you and other media outlets and try to shine a hot spotlight on it, because it's amazing when we do, as they say, sunlight's the best disinfectant.
I'm going to have to break in, Darren, because we're running out of time. Thank you so much for being on the show, and we'll be in touch again to get you back. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
All right, that was Darren McKinney, and we'll be right back.
GrokTalk.
Steve McDonald here. You ever notice how Democrats like to create problems so they can then claim to solve them? Take Medicaid expansion, for example. Even if the federal government keeps its promise to New Hampshire to pay for most of it, it'll still cost New Hampshire taxpayers tens of millions of dollars more to provide inferior care and coverage to people who, for the most part, would never have needed it if Democrats hadn't reformed health care in the first place. That's right, that real expensive reform that doesn't care if it's only affordable if you act like you don't need insurance. Well, its #1 claim to fame at this point is how many more people it forced onto Medicaid. And that's only because Obamacare kicks tens of millions of people off the plan they liked and were told they could keep but couldn't. So Medicaid expansion was always part of Obamacare for a reason. Democrats knew all along that the Affordable Care Act was unaffordable and they'd need to make Medicaid bigger and more expensive, so when people got their plan kicked to the health care curb, they could still sign up for something, even if it was something as crappy as Medicaid. This is Steve McDonald for GrokTalk, and we'll keep shining the light on them for you.
Hi, this is Rich Gerard, host of Gerard at Large in the Morning. The Manchester area's only locally owned, locally operated, focused, and interested, riveting radio show, heard live every Monday through Friday from 6 to 9 on 90.7 FM WLMW, New Hampshire Family Radio, and available 24/7 live or archived at GerardAtLarge.com. Be sure to tune in.
This is a coalition of New Hampshire taxpayers. We're located at 8 North Main in Concord, New Hampshire. This is a repository for all things conservative and municipal. So if you have a problem in your town, your school, your budget committee, the right to know law, and now the top of our list is voter fraud. You have a tip for us, some information for us, you want to join or help us out, cnht.org.
Hi, this is Earl Hall from The Earl Hall Show, and you're listening to GrokTalk.
Grok TV.